The restaurant was not fancy. It was the kind of place people visited after a long day when they wanted warm food and a quiet corner to sit. The tables were clean but old. The chairs made small sounds when someone moved, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with coffee filled the air. Outside, traffic moved slowly, and the afternoon sun pushed the windows, lighting up dust in the air. A man in an expensive suit walked in like he owned the place. His shoes were polished, his watch shined, and his phone never left his hand. He was used to attention. Wherever he went, people noticed him. Some admired him. Some feared him. Most stayed quiet around him. He chose a table near the window and sat down without looking at anyone. He placed his phone on the table, checked a message, and smiled to himself. He had just finished a meeting nearby, one that had ended exactly the way he wanted. Another deal closed. Another win. Days like this made him feel sharp, unbeatable. He looked around the restaurant slowly, as if studying it. His eyes stopped on the waitress walking between tables. She moved calmly, balancing plates with ease. Her uniform was simple. Her hair was tied back. There was nothing loud about her, nothing that demanded attention. He watched her for a moment and made a quiet judgment in his mind. He had done this his whole life. People were puzzles to him, and he believed he could solve them in seconds. He believed money had taught him how to read people better than any book ever could. When the waitress reached his table, she smiled politely. It was not a fake smile. It was the kind that came from long hours of work and habit. "Good afternoon," she said. "What can I get for you?" He barely looked at the menu. "Coffee," he said. "Black." She nodded and wrote it down. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "You must serve a lot of people like me," he said casually. She paused and turned back. "A lot of different people," she replied. He leaned back in his chair. "People with money," he said, smiling slightly. "You can tell, can't you?" She kept her tone calm. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes not." That answer surprised him a little. Most people would agree quickly. He studied her face again. Still calm, still polite. She walked away to get the coffee. He watched her go, feeling a small spark of curiosity. It had been a boring week, and he enjoyed moments like this, moments where he could prove something, even if only to himself. When she returned with the coffee, she placed it gently on the table. "Is there anything else you like?" He stirred the coffee slowly. "You enjoy this job?" he asked. She met his eyes. "It keeps me busy," she said. He smiled wider. "Busy isn't the same as successful," he replied. She didn't react. "That depends on how you define success." That answer caught his attention again. He set a spoon down. "You know," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "I've always believed smart people don't stay in jobs like this for long." The words were sharp, but he said them like a joke, like something harmless. He expected her to laugh it off, maybe look uncomfortable. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Some people leave, some stay." He leaned forward. "And you?" "I'm here," she said simply. He felt a small sense of control return. This was more familiar ground. He had seen this many times. People with limited choices, pretending they were happy. He decided to push a little more. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Do you think intelligence matters more than luck?" She looked at him carefully now, not defensive, just curious. "I think both matter," she replied. "But people talk about intelligence more because it sounds better." He laughed softly. "That's an interesting way to put it." A couple at a nearby table glanced over. The conversation had started to feel heavier than normal restaurant talk. He crossed his arms. "I'm a businessman," he said proudly. "I didn't get where I am by accident." She nodded again. "I'm sure you worked hard." That response annoyed him slightly. He wanted admiration, not balance. He wanted her to agree fully. "So tell me," he said, tapping the table, "if someone is truly smart, why would they choose to serve coffee?" She didn't answer right away. She took a breath, as if choosing her words. "Sometimes people choose what gives them peace," she said, "not what looks impressive." The words were simple, but they landed heavier than he expected. He felt a small pause inside himself, a moment of silence he didn't like. He smiled again, sharper this time. "Peace doesn't pay bills," he said. It pays in other ways, she replied. Now he was fully engaged. This was no longer small talk. This felt like a challenge. You don't sound like most waitresses, he said. She smiled slightly. I don't think most people sound the same. He watched her closely. There was no anger in her face. No need to defend herself. That bothered him more than an argument would have. Around them, the restaurant continued as normal. Plates clinked. A door opened and closed. But at that table, something had shifted. He took a sip of coffee and said, "Let's do something fun." She raised an eyebrow. "What kind of fun?" "A little test," he said. "Just a conversation. No harm in that." She looked at the other tables, then back at him, "As long as it stays respectful." He smiled confidently. Of course. Inside, he already believed he had the upper hand. He believed this would end the way such things always did, with him proving a point. He didn't realize yet that the test had already begun, and he was not the one in control. The man sipped his coffee slowly, feeling the warmth spread through his hands. He was used to being in control, used to knowing the answer before the question was even fully asked. He looked at the waitress and decided it was time to see just how much she understood. He leaned slightly forward, a confident smile on his face, and began speaking in a way that was casual but meant to test her. "Tell me something," he said, lowering his voice. "Have you ever had to make a big decision quickly? One that could change everything?" She paused for a moment, considering the question, and then nodded. "Yes," she said. "Everyone has at some point." He raised an eyebrow. "Everyone? That's a broad answer. Can you give an example?" She thought for a moment, then smiled slightly. "I decided to take this job, even though I could have gone somewhere else. I wanted to learn something about people, about patience, about how the world works in ways that money can't always show." He leaned back and chuckled. Interesting answer. Most people would say they took a job for money or for status. She shook her head. Not everyone. Some people are curious about life itself. That's more important to me than a title or a paycheck. He studied her carefully. There was no boastfulness, no arrogance in her tone, just a calm certainty that seemed almost unnatural to him. He liked being in control, but her calmness made him slightly uncomfortable. He decided to try a different approach. "Let me ask you another thing," he said. "If someone gave you a large amount of money, would you quit your job?" She looked at him directly. "Not necessarily. Money doesn't always solve the real problems or bring the kind of satisfaction people expect. Sometimes it just creates new ones." He blinked. That was not the answer he expected. Most people would have said yes immediately, or at least seemed excited at the thought. But she had answered thoughtfully, carefully, as if she had already considered the implications. "Interesting," he said, smiling slightly. "You're smarter than most people I meet." She gave a small smile back. "I try to think before I act." He decided to test her further. He wanted to see if she could actually challenge him in a way that would be fun. "All right," he said, leaning forward. "Let's say someone wants to be successful. What's more important, intelligence or hard work?" She nodded slowly, thinking for a moment. Both are important. But hard work without understanding can be wasted. Intelligence without action is useless. It's the combination that matters most. He felt a flicker of surprise. She had answered quickly but with depth, something he wasn't used to from people in her position. He decided to push a little further. "Suppose you had a choice," he continued, "between a secure life with steady income and a risky path that could either fail or make you rich beyond imagination. What would you choose?" She looked down at her notepad for a moment, then back up at him. "I would choose the path that teaches me more about myself and the world. Sometimes a risky path isn't about money at all. It's about growth and understanding." He felt a small sting of unease. She was answering in ways that exposed the weaknesses in his thinking without even trying. He had expected to challenge her, but somehow she was challenging him instead. The restaurant was quieter now. People nearby had begun to notice the unusual conversation. He could feel their eyes occasionally glancing over. This was not the usual polite small talk. He liked attention, but this made him slightly nervous. He decided to change tactics, hoping to regain the upper hand. "All right," he said, "let's talk about people who fail. Most people fail because they're not smart enough. Don't you agree?" She shook her head gently. Failure comes from many reasons. Lack of planning, bad choices, timing, and sometimes things beyond our control. Intelligence is just one part of the equation. He felt a little frustration building. She was right, of course, but he didn't like being reminded of the limits of his own beliefs. He wanted admiration, not correction. He tried again, leaning in slightly. Tell me, what's the smartest thing a person can do in life? She smiled softly. Understand themselves. Understand the people around them. And never assume that money or status equals wisdom. Her answer hit harder than he expected. For years, he had measured himself by deals, numbers, and power. Her words were simple, but they held a quiet truth that made him pause. He stirred his coffee again. Feeling it cooling in the cup, he decided to push one last time before ending the conversation. Do you think most people will be able to hold up under the kind of pressure I deal with? She looked at him directly. Some could, some couldn't. But pressure isn't only about wealth or power. It's about choices, responsibility, and knowing what really matters. Some people manage pressure better because they understand themselves. Some people fail because they don't. He didn't respond immediately. Her words made him think. He had come here expecting to feel superior, to have a little fun at someone else's expense. But instead, he was being made to reflect on things he didn't usually consider. She smiled again lightly and said, Don't get me wrong. You've worked hard and done well. But intelligence and success are not the same thing. They never really were. The man put down a spoon and ran a hand over his face. He had been so sure he could measure her in seconds. But now, he felt a strange mix of surprise and respect. She was calm, clear, and sharp. He had expected her to hesitate or stumble. She hadn't. Around them, the restaurant carried on. Other waitresses moved quickly between tables, delivering plates, clearing dishes. The sound of conversation and laughter filled the air. But at their table, time felt different. It was slower, deeper, and filled with a tension he didn't fully understand. He decided to shift the tone, trying to regain the familiar feeling of control. You have a way with words, he said. I didn't expect this from someone in your position. She nodded politely. Position doesn't always determine understanding. He felt a little smile creep onto his face. He couldn't help it. She had the upper hand. And yet, it was not offensive. It was subtle, gentle, and completely unexpected. He realized for the first time in a long while that he was enjoying a conversation where he was not fully in charge. He leaned back, sipped his coffee, and allowed a small silence to stretch between them. He had come here to test her. He had expected amusement, not reflection. And yet, in the quiet moments that followed, he felt a strange respect growing. She turned to leave briefly, checking on another table, then returned to his side. Would you like a refill? She asked. Yes, please, he said. But this time, his voice lacked its usual confidence. There was something softer in it, something new. As she walked away to get the coffee, he stared out the window. He watched people passing by, each absorbed in their own lives, unaware of the small but significant encounter happening inside the restaurant. He felt a shift in his thinking, subtle but undeniable. He realized he had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had underestimated the simple truth that intelligence is not always obvious, and it is not always loud. She returned with the coffee, placing it carefully on the table. He nodded in thanks, still deep in thought. He realized the test he had planned had already begun, but it was not going the way he had imagined. She had passed without even knowing she was being tested. And in that moment, he felt something unfamiliar. Curiosity about how the rest of this interaction would unfold, and perhaps a hint of humility about the assumptions he carried. The waitress returned to the table with a fresh cup of coffee, placing it carefully in front of him. Her hands were steady, her expression calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. The man noticed the small details, the way she held the cup, the precision in her movements, the small confidence in her posture. Each detail made him feel a little more uncertain, though he tried to hide it. Thank you, he said, trying to sound casual. I think we were talking about intelligence before. Let's continue. She nodded. Of course, she said. I was thinking about what you said earlier about intelligence and success. You said it is about understanding people and making decisions, right? He leaned back, sipping his coffee. Exactly. That's why most people fail. They lack understanding. She tilted her head slightly. Do you think everyone fails because they are not intelligent or because they do not see the bigger picture? He paused. He had not expected her to answer with a question. It was a small trick, but effective. He felt a familiar need to explain, to assert, to teach. The bigger picture, he said slowly. Yes, of course. But you must be smart to see it. Without intelligence, you can't understand the risks, the opportunities, the people around you. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes calm but focused. I think intelligence is only part of the story. Knowledge, patience, and experience play roles just as important. And sometimes humility allows people to see things that intelligence alone cannot. He frowned slightly. Humility, that was a word he rarely considered. He had built his life on confidence, decisiveness, and certainty. To hear someone imply that humility mattered more than sharpness felt strange. He decided to test her further, wanting to regain the upper hand. Let's suppose someone offered you a chance to become extremely wealthy in a short time, he said, leaning forward, hands clasped together. But the catch is that it involves risk and responsibility. Would you take it? She looked at him for a moment, considering the question. I would only take it if I understood the consequences, if I could see how it affected not just me but the people around me. He nodded slowly, pretending to think. Most people would jump at the opportunity, without considering the consequences. They would be blinded by greed. She smiled faintly. Greed can blind anyone, no matter how wealthy or intelligent they are. But the ability to pause, to think, to understand impact, that is what separates action from reaction. He felt the first real sting of embarrassment. Her words were simple, but they cut through his assumptions. He had assumed she would be impressed by wealth or intimidated by knowledge. Instead, she had given answers that were measured, grounded, and unshakable. He shifted in his seat, trying to regain composure. All right, he said. You seem to understand more than most people. Let's test that. Tell me something. If someone is truly smart, how do they handle people who underestimate them? She didn't answer immediately. She studied him, as if reading not just his words, but the person behind them. They stay calm, she said finally. They don't need to prove themselves immediately. They watch, they listen, they choose the right moment to act. They do not react out of pride or ego. He felt a sharp awareness inside himself. Pride, ego. He had always considered these as tools, not weaknesses. But her words made him question that belief. He had entered this restaurant confident, planning to test her. Now he felt a subtle shift, the sense that he was being measured without realizing it. He leaned back and ran a hand through his hair. He had never enjoyed a conversation like this. It was not entertaining in the usual sense. It was uncomfortable, thought-provoking, and it forced him to see gaps in his own reasoning. He tried to deflect with a smile. You're very calm. Most people will be intimidated by my questions. She shrugged slightly. Intimidation doesn't teach you anything. Curiosity does. I'm curious about your perspective, not intimidated by your status. He felt a flicker of admiration. Curiosity, that was a trait he respected in others, but rarely saw directed toward himself in a non-complimentary way. He decided to continue, hoping he could still guide the conversation. Tell me, he said, how do you deal with people who try to trick you, test you, or challenge you? She looked at him directly. I observe. I listen. I respond carefully. I never assume that the person's intention is always negative. Sometimes tests reveal more about the person giving them than the one receiving them. He felt a strange pause in his chest. He had been giving her a test all along, thinking he was in control, and yet she had already seen through him, through the assumptions, through the subtle challenge he created. She had not reacted angrily. She had not faltered. She had simply answered with clarity. He decided to push one last time, curious how far this could go. Let's say someone has all the wealth in the world, but no understanding of people, no patience, no humility. Do you think they can ever truly be successful? She looked at him steadily. Not truly. Money and status can open doors, but they do not teach wisdom. Wisdom comes from understanding, from listening, from humility, and from learning from experience. Without these, Even the wealthiest person can fail in ways that matter most. He felt a sudden shift in the room, as if her words had drawn the walls closer. He realized that she was not just answering questions. She was leading him to see truths he had never wanted to consider. He was no longer the one asking the questions. He was the one being quietly examined, and her observations were precise and undeniable. The restaurant felt quieter now, though the sounds of dishes and conversation continued around them. He was aware of the space between them, the subtle tension that had built. For a man who thrived on control, it was a new and uncomfortable sensation. She smiled faintly, not mockingly, not triumphantly, but with a quiet assurance. Intelligence is not about showing off, or being the loudest, or winning a test. True intelligence is measured in thoughtfulness, patience, and the ability to understand more than just the surface of things. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of frustration and admiration. She had outsmarted him not by being flashy, but by being steady, thoughtful, and clear. He realized that the test he had planned so confidently had already been turned against him, subtly, carefully, and completely. He stirred his coffee again, but this time he tasted more than just bitterness. He tasted realization, the understanding that the assumptions he had carried for so long might be wrong. That intelligence is not always obvious. That humility and observation can outweigh status and wealth in ways he had not considered. She gave him a small nod, sensing the shift without drawing attention to it. "It's interesting," she said quietly, "how sometimes the people who believe they are testing others end up learning the most themselves." He didn't respond immediately. The words sank in slowly, deeply. He had come here expecting to amuse himself, to prove a point, to feel superior. Instead, he had found himself reflecting on things he rarely considered, questioning assumptions, and facing truths he had avoided. As the conversation stretched on, he realized that the quiet, calm presence of the waitress had changed the dynamic completely. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued or boasted. She had simply responded with clarity, patience, and wisdom. Around them, the restaurant continued its usual rhythm, oblivious of the subtle battle that had been quietly won at one small table. And at that table, the man felt a new and unfamiliar feeling: humility, curiosity, and a growing respect for the person he had so confidently underestimated. The man sat back in his chair, feeling a strange mix of admiration and frustration. He had come into the restaurant ready to amuse himself, ready to prove something to a young waitress who he thought would be easy to impress or intimidate. Instead, the conversation had shifted. She had answered every question with thoughtfulness, patience, and clarity. It was no longer a simple test. It was a reflection on his own beliefs and assumptions. The waitress leaned on the edge of the table slightly, her hands relaxed. She seemed almost unbothered by the fact that she had turned the situation around. "You know," she said quietly, "I don't often get asked questions like these, but it's interesting to talk about them, even with someone I just met." He raised an eyebrow. "And what makes it interesting?" he asked, genuinely curious now. "Because people rarely ask these questions sincerely," she replied. "Most ask to hear what they want to hear. But you're asking to see what I think. That's different." He felt a small sting of realization. He had assumed the entire time that he was the one in control, that he was giving a test. But her response made it clear she had seen the situation clearly from the start. She had understood his intentions, his pride, and his assumptions, and she had navigated them effortlessly. "Tell me something about yourself," he said, leaning forward. "If intelligence and wisdom matter so much to you, why are you here? Why this job?" She smiled faintly, as if she had been waiting for him to ask the question. "I've worked in many places before," she began. "Some positions required titles. Others required long hours and endless responsibility. I have a background in management and education. I've studied, trained, and learned from people who have had far more money than I do now." He blinked. He had not expected that answer. For someone who seemed ordinary, her experience and insight were far beyond what he had assumed. "I could have chosen a more prestigious job," she continued. "I could have sought higher positions in corporations or taken roles that would have brought me status. But I chose this work because it allows me to understand people. It allows me to see the world through their eyes, to practice patience, empathy, and observation every day. I learn more here than I ever did in any office. He felt a wave of surprise. This was not the simple person he had expected. Her choice to work here was deliberate, informed, and thoughtful. She was not limited by circumstance. She was making a conscious choice, and that made him rethink everything he had assumed. "You're saying this is intentional?" he asked slowly. "Yes," she said. "I'm here by choice, not by necessity. I wanted to understand how people behave, how they react, and how they make decisions under pressure. And I've learned more from this than from many of the people who boast about their intelligence and wealth." He felt a sense of humility he hadn't felt in years. He had always measured success and intelligence by money, status, and control. Yet here was someone without the same resources who had cultivated wisdom, patience, and understanding beyond what he had achieved. "And that's why you were able to answer all my questions so calmly?" he asked, leaning back. She nodded. "Yes. I listen, I observe, I think. I don't react immediately. I consider the meaning behind words and actions. That gives me perspective, even in situations where people assume they're in control." He swallowed, realizing that he'd been the one under examination all along. His attempt to test her had been transparent to her from the start. She had responded in ways that demonstrated clarity and intelligence he hadn't expected, and now the truth of her experience and understanding was clear. "Most people would not see this," she continued. "They would assume that a job defines a person. They would judge someone by appearance, by role, or by status. But intelligence and wisdom cannot be measured by titles or money alone. They show in thoughtfulness, in patience, and in the ability to understand more than just oneself." He felt a quiet respect growing. The arrogance he had carried in his approach was slowly giving way to curiosity and humility. He wanted to understand more, to know the story behind her confidence. "Your background," he said slowly, it surprises me. You've learned more than I assumed someone in your position could know." She smiled, but it was not prideful. It was calm, assured. Learning isn't about position or wealth. It's about choices, observation, and reflection. I've taken opportunities to learn where others overlook them, and I've chosen experiences that others might consider small or insignificant because they teach lessons that money cannot buy. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "And all this wisdom you have, it's been applied here? In a restaurant?" "Yes," she said. "Every interaction is an opportunity to observe, understand, and practice patience. Every person who comes through that door has a story. Some are loud, some are quiet, some are confident, some are arrogant. Each one teaches me something. I pay attention, I reflect, and I learn. That is why I can respond calmly when someone tries to test me or provoke me or assume they're superior." He felt the weight of her words. He had assumed superiority based on wealth and position. He had believed he could measure her quickly, that he could play a game and win. And now the truth was clear. She had chosen a path that made her thoughtful, observant, and wise, and she had already passed his test without effort. He felt a sense of admiration mixed with embarrassment. He had underestimated her completely. He had expected a simple conversation to entertain himself, and instead he had been made to reflect on the limits of his own assumptions. The realization was powerful, uncomfortable, and enlightening. "I see now," he said quietly. "You've thought about these things far more than I did. You've made deliberate choices to understand the world in ways that I haven't, despite my wealth and experience." She nodded. "Yes, and I think that is why intelligence and success are often misunderstood. People assume wealth equals wisdom, but it does not. True understanding comes from experience, reflection, and observation, not just power or money." He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He realized he had come into this restaurant expecting to feel superior. Instead, he had encountered someone who taught him, gently, that assumptions could blind even the most confident person. She had revealed her background not to boast, but to explain the depth of her choices and the clarity of her understanding. Around them, the restaurant carried on its quiet rhythm. Plates were cleared, conversations hummed, and the sunlight shifted slightly through the windows. But at that small table, the atmosphere had changed. There was a quiet power in her calm, a subtle authority in her wisdom, an undeniable truth that even wealth and status could not overshadow. He realized that the lesson was not just about intelligence, not just about money, not just about success. It was about humility, observation, and understanding. It was about recognizing that people cannot be measured by appearances, and that wisdom often comes from deliberate choice, reflection, and experience rather than position or wealth. He nodded slowly, a sense of respect and humility settling over him. The waitress had revealed not just her background, but a deeper truth about life, intelligence, and the limits of assumptions. And in that moment, he understood that the test he had tried to give her had failed. Not because she played games, but because she had lived a life of thoughtful observation, patience, and deliberate choice, and her understanding was far greater than he had imagined. The man sat quietly for a moment, holding his coffee but not drinking it. The words of the waitress still echoed in his mind. He had come into the restaurant full of confidence, ready to amuse himself and test her intelligence. Now, he felt a mixture of humility, reflection, and something he had not felt in a long time, curiosity about what he could learn. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time he saw her not as a waitress, not as a simple person to test, but as someone who had chosen her path deliberately, someone who understood more about life than he had realized. The realization was both humbling and enlightening. "I have to admit," he said finally, his voice soft but sincere, "I expected this conversation to be simple. I expected to test you and have a little fun proving my point. But instead, I feel like I've been tested, and the truth is, I've learned more than I anticipated." The waitress smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but with understanding. "Sometimes the people who think they are teaching others are the ones who learn the most," she said gently. He nodded, taking in the weight of her words. He had spent decades measuring people by their titles, their wealth, their appearances. He had assumed intelligence could be judged in seconds by conversation or by subtle behavior. But she had shown him that understanding was deeper, quieter, and far more profound than anything money or status could measure. "Your perspective, it's remarkable," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's not what I expected at all. I assumed that someone in your position would be easy to read, easy to underestimate, but you've proven me completely wrong." She shrugged lightly, a calm expression on her face. "I don't think it's about proving anyone wrong. I just respond based on what I know, what I've experienced, and what I observe. That's all anyone can do." He felt a small smile form, a mix of humility and amusement. For the first time in a long time, he felt genuinely challenged in a way that wasn't aggressive or competitive, but reflective. He realized that learning from someone else's perspective could be far more valuable than asserting dominance or proving a point. "I see now," he said quietly, "that intelligence is not always loud. It's not always obvious. And wealth, it doesn't always reflect wisdom or understanding." She nodded again. "Exactly. Intelligence, wisdom, understanding, they often show in patience, in observation, in the way people think before they act, not in how much they own or how quickly they react." He took a slow sip of coffee, savoring both the warmth and the moment. The atmosphere at the table had changed. It was no longer a test, a challenge, or a display of superiority. It was a quiet lesson, a reflection on choices, humility, and the true meaning of understanding. He looked around the restaurant briefly, at the other patrons laughing, talking, and enjoying their meals. None of them would know the small but profound conversation that had just unfolded at his table. It was private, subtle, but it had the power to shift his perspective in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I have to apologize," he said finally, his voice sincere. "I came in thinking I could judge you, maybe even amuse myself at your expense. I see now that assumption was completely wrong. I underestimated you." She smiled, but not in a way that demanded anything from him. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the moment. "Acknowledging it is enough," she said softly. "We all make assumptions. The important thing is to recognize them and learn from them." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. For a man used to control, power, and certainty, it was a lesson in humility he hadn't expected to receive in a small restaurant over coffee. He reached into his pocket and left a generous tip on the table, not out of obligation, but as a gesture of respect. It was more than money. It was recognition of the insight and wisdom that had been shared. She noticed it, but she didn't comment. Instead, she simply nodded and returned to her duties, calm and unshaken, confident in the choices she had made and the knowledge she had shared. There was no need for acknowledgement, no need for approval. She had already made her point, and the lesson was complete. He watched her go, reflecting on the encounter. He realized that true intelligence often remained quiet, subtle, and sometimes invisible until someone paid attention. True wisdom came not from asserting dominance or proving a point, but from understanding, patience, and observation. And humility, he thought, was the greatest teacher of all. The sunlight shifted across the room, illuminating the dust motes in the air. The sound of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of plates continued around him, but he sat quietly, absorbing the experience. It was a rare moment of reflection in a life usually driven by achievement and ambition. He realized that he would carry this lesson with him long after leaving the restaurant. He would remember the calm, confident presence of the waitress, the deliberate choices she had made, and the clarity of thought she had displayed. It was a reminder that people cannot be measured by appearances, titles, or wealth, and that true understanding often comes from places one least expects. As he finally rose from the table to leave, he gave a small nod to her, a silent acknowledgement of respect and gratitude. She returned the nod with the same calm assurance that had characterized the entire conversation. Outside, the sun was lower in the sky, casting a golden light across the street. He walked slowly, thinking about the lessons of the day. For a man who had spent much of his life measuring success and intelligence by wealth and status, the encounter had shifted his perspective. He realized that learning, understanding, and humility were far more important than he had ever acknowledged. And somewhere in the quiet of the restaurant, the waitress continued her work, observing, learning, and practicing patience. She had not needed to assert dominance or prove a point. Her wisdom had spoken for itself, and the man who had come in full of confidence left with a lesson that would stay with him forever. In that small, ordinary place, a quiet transformation had occurred. One person had shared insight through experience and observation, and another had been willing to receive it with humility. The lesson was simple yet profound. Intelligence is measured not by money, not by status, but by understanding, patience, and the courage to see beyond assumptions.